I stared at Kyle in disbelief, his words cutting deeper than any knife. "A barren bitch?" I repeated, the venom dripping from his drunken slur. The wedding reception around us fell silent, all eyes turning towards the commotion. "You heard me," Kyle sneered, his face flushed from too much whiskey. "When are you going to accept that you're defective? We should have never gotten married." White-hot shame burned my cheeks as I looked around at my family's horrified expressions. My sister Amy's hand flew to her mouth, her beautiful wedding day now marred by her new brother-in-law's cruelty. In that moment, I knew my marriage was over. How could I ever forgive such a humiliating insult, hurled at me simply for being unable to conceive? The one thing I'd been upfront about from the start, yet Kyle had promised to accept. I thought back to those early days when we first met. I was his realtor during his bitter divorce. Despite the awkward circumstances, an unexpected spark had formed between us. Kyle love-bombed me with reassurances that my infertility didn't matter, that he just wanted to build a life with me. Looking into his glazed, hateful eyes now, I barely recognized that same man. "I'm leaving," I declared, fighting back tears. I refused to allow Kyle to see me crumble. Not after he'd so callously disrespected me in front of everyone. "Yeah, get out of my face," he growled, swaying on unsteady feet. "Useless." I stormed out with as much dignity as I could muster, my heart shattering into pieces. How could someone I loved turn so monstrous over the very issue he claimed to accept? In the parking lot, I collapsed against my car, sobs racking my body. Distantly, I heard Amy calling my name, but I couldn't bear to face her, or anyone right now. I just wanted to go home, to the house I'd worked so hard to purchase through a successful real estate career. A career that had always come first for me, until my biological clock started ticking and I realized how much I longed for a child of my own. A dream that now seemed permanently out of reach because of my so-called husband's cruelty. Anger began to eclipse my sadness as I thought about all the times I'd broached trying IVF, only for Kyle to shut me down or make excuses for not getting tested himself. Was this his plan all along? To string me along until he could publicly humiliate me over my infertility? Well, if that was the game he wanted to play, I vowed in that moment to make him pay dearly. I would fight for everything in the divorce, the house, the assets, the whole 9 yards. And I wouldn't stop there. Kyle had awoken a vengeful fire within me that would burn every last part of his miserable existence to the ground. Whatever it took, I would make him suffer as he'd made me suffer tonight. He wanted to see a real bitch. He was about to meet one, and by the time I was done with him, he'd have a new word for what I was: unstoppable. I couldn't get the image of Kyle's cruel sneer out of my mind as I sat alone in the dimly lit bar nursing a glass of Cabernet. Normally, I preferred to drink at home, but tonight I needed the ambiance of somewhere public to take my mind off the events at Amy's wedding reception. "Can I get you another?" The bartender nodded towards my empty glass, but I shook my head. One was enough for me to take the edge off without going overboard. As I sipped the last few ruby drops, my mind drifted back to those first giddy months when Kyle and I began dating. He'd been so attentive, so understanding about my infertility struggles. Looking back, I realized he'd simply been mirroring me, telling me exactly what I wanted to hear. We'd met during one of the lowest points of my life, Kyle hiring me as his realtor to sell the house he'd shared with his ex-wife. Despite the somber circumstances, there was an undeniable spark between us from that first open house walkthrough. "I have to admit, you're making this painful process a lot more bearable," Kyle had said with a warm smile, his hazel eyes crinkling at the corners. "You've got a great bedside manner for an agent." I'd felt an unexpected flutter in my chest at the compliment. "Well, I do try to make my clients as comfortable as possible during emotional transitions like this." "Oh, I'm definitely comfortable around you," he'd said with a wink, leaving me flustered but intrigued. Over the next few weeks, Kyle's harmless flirtations escalated until he finally asked me out for drinks. I'll admit I was hesitant at first. Dating a client seemed like such a conflict of interest, but Kyle a charming, persistent man, and eventually I gave in to his pursuit. "I want you to know, I'm okay with the fact that you can't have kids," he'd said on one of our first dates, catching me off guard with his forwardness. "My ex put me through hell trying to get pregnant for years. I'm kind of relieved not to go through that again. I'd tensed up, prepared for the usual rejection that came whenever I disclosed my infertility to potential partners. But Kyle simply reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Hey, I mean it. That's not a deal breaker for me at all. You're smart, successful, beautiful. What more could a guy want? His easy acceptance was like a balm to the wound I'd carried for so long. Here was a man who didn't care about my inability to bear children, who seemed to genuinely want me for me. How naive I was back then. Another glass of wine? The bartender's voice pulled me from my reverie. I looked up, blinking against the harsh lights. No, I'm good. Just get me my tab, please. I needed to sober up and clear my head. As I settled the bill and headed for the door, anger began to simmer within me once again. How dare Kyle take the one part of me I'd always been upfront about and use it as a weapon against me? After he'd sworn up and down it didn't matter? Well, if he thought he'd be rid of me so easily, he had another thing coming. I was done being the sad, yearning woman he could trample over. From here on out, Kyle was going to learn exactly what a real bitch looked like. And by the time I was through with him, he'd be begging for mercy. I took a deep, steadying breath before ringing the doorbell of my own home. It had been 3 days since Kyle's atrocious outburst at Amy's wedding, and I'd temporarily been staying at a hotel to clear my head. But it was time to rip off the Band-Aid. The door swung open, and Kyle stood there, his expression unreadable. He didn't appear hungover or remorseful in the slightest. "We need to talk," I said firmly, pushing past him into the hallway. He silently followed me into the living room, taking a seat in the recliner as I perched on the edge of the sofa. "I've been thinking a lot about our situation," I began carefully. "What you said at the wedding was—" I had to pause to collect myself. "It was unforgivable, Kyle. You humiliated me in front of my entire family." He opened his mouth, presumably to offer some half-baked apology, but I held up a hand to stop him. "Don't. Just don't. I don't want to hear excuses or hollow apologies. What's done is done, and I can't look past that kind of cruelty." Kyle's jaw tightened mulishly. "So what? You're just going to give up on us? On having a family?" I laughed bitterly at that. "You're the one who gave up on that dream long ago. When was the last time you even entertained the idea of fertility treatments, of doing whatever it takes to make a child happen for us?" Silence answered me, just as I expected. Kyle had been stonewalling my attempts to pursue IVF or even get basic testing done. "That's what I thought," I said, more to myself than him. "The truth is, you've checked out of this marriage for a while. You just didn't have the backbone to end it yourself." "That's not true," Kyle snapped, finally showing a flicker of emotion. "Jesus, Vivian, you know how much I want a kid of my own. But conventional routes haven't worked, and I'm not interested in exploring other options right now." I stared at him in disbelief. "Are you serious right now? You're the one putting roadblocks in our way at every turn. Anytime I bring up IVF, you shut me down immediately." "Those treatments are expensive and intrusive," he countered. "I'm not comfortable subjecting you to that until we've exhausted all other possibilities." "Like what?" I threw up my hands in exasperation. "We're not getting any younger, Kyle. And you refuse to even get your fertility tested to see if the issue is on your end." An ugly look crossed his face then. "Oh, so now you're implying I'm the problem? That's real rich coming from Miss Barren, bitch." White-hot rage lanced through me at his vicious reuse of that degrading insult. Before I could stop myself, I grabbed the heavy crystal vase from the end table and whipped it directly at his head. Kyle ducked just in time, the vase shattering against the wall in an explosion of glass and water. We both froze, chests heaving, staring at each other in shock. In that moment, I knew there was no going back for us. Whatever tender feelings I'd once harbored for this man were gone, eroded by a callousness I could no longer excuse or endure. "Get out," I said in a low, trembling voice. "Get your shit and get out of my house." For once, Kyle seemed to understand I was deadly serious. He stood slowly, holding my gaze with an unreadable look. Then, without another word, he turned and left the room to pack his things. 3 weeks had passed since I kicked Kyle out, and I was just starting to feel like I could breathe again. The divorce proceedings were underway, and with each legal maneuver, I felt layers of his toxic presence being stripped away from my life. I should have known it wouldn't last. The incessant ringing of my cell dragged me from a restful slumber. Frowning, I squinted at the caller ID. It was Kyle. Again. I let it go to voicemail like I had been doing for days. Wrapping my robe around me, I shuffled into the kitchen to brew some coffee, trying to shake off the grogginess. My phone began ringing once more from the other room. For fuck's sake, I muttered, abandoning my pursuit of caffeine to snatch up the device. What? Don't hang up, Kyle's voice came through the line, thick and slurred. Of course he was drunk. We need to talk. I have nothing to say to you, I replied coldly. This divorce is happening whether you like it or not. Vivian, baby, listen to me. He was beginning to ramble, his words running together unintelligibly. I pinched the bridge of my nose in frustration. Kyle, you're wasted. I'm not doing this right now. I met someone, he suddenly blurted out. I stilled, ice flooding my veins. What did you say? There's this girl at work. Kyle barreled on, uncaring of the fresh hell he was putting me through. Her name's Jade, pretty little thing, you know, with workin' ovaries and all that. My breath came in harsh pants as I digested the full extent of his betrayal. He'd been cheating on me this whole time, with some fertile young thing who could give him what I couldn't. You son of a bitch, I hissed through gritted teeth. How long has this been going on? Does it matter? Kyle slurred carelessly. Face it, Viv, we were dead in the water from the start. You got a defective body, and I got needs, you know? I was trembling with rage, my knuckles white from gripping the phone so tightly. How dare he? How dare he try to blame this on me after he'd sworn my infertility was no issue? I want you to listen to me very carefully, Kyle, I said in a low, dangerous tone. You're going to sober up, and you're going to gather whatever pathetic belongings you have left at this house. Because I swear to God, if you show up here again uninvited, I will call the police and have you arrested for trespassing. There was a pause, then Kyle snorted derisively. You always did have a flair for the dramatic, babe. That's what I'll miss most about you. I disconnected the call without another word, my entire body shaking with hatred and disgust. The man I had loved, the man I nearly sacrificed my career for to start a family with, had revealed himself as an abusive, unfaithful monster. Fine. If this was how he wanted to play it, I would oblige him. No more Mrs. Nice Guy. It was time to fight fire with hellfire. I would take him for every last penny and asset in this divorce, and that would just be the start. By the time I was through with Kyle, he would have absolutely nothing left. No money, no reputation, no future. Just a shell of the man who thought he could walk all over me and get away with it. He wanted to see a real bitch? Oh, he was going to get one. And this time she would be utterly unstoppable. The sharp clack of my heels against the marble floor echoed through the cavernous courthouse lobby as I strode towards the designated courtroom. My stomach was a roiling knot of nerves and fury, but I refused to let it show on my face. I was all business today. Kyle was already seated at the defendant's table when I arrived, slouched in his chair with a sullen expression. His lawyer leaned over to murmur something in his ear, but he just shrugged listlessly. Typical Kyle, never taking anything seriously until it was too late. Miss Archer, my attorney Jessica, greeted me with a warm smile as I took my place. Are you ready for this? I gave her a curt nod, my jaw clenched tightly. More than ready. I'd been counting down the days until I could finally face Kyle in this arena and make him pay for his deplorable actions. The judge entered and called the court into session. I tuned out the usual procedural blah blah, keeping my eyes trained on Kyle with laser focus. He refused to meet my gaze, however, fixing his stare somewhere in the middle distance. Finally, it was time for opening statements. Kyle's lawyer, some smug jackass in an expensive suit, stood and launched into a long-winded diatribe about how his client was just a poor, downtrodden man being persecuted by his wife's inability to have children. How Kyle had stuck by me for years, waiting patiently to start a family, only to have his dreams crushed by my medical condition. I had to grip the table to keep from erupting at the blatant character assassination. How dare they try to paint Kyle as some sort of long-suffering victim, after the unspeakable way he disrespected and betrayed me? When it was Jessica's turn, she calmly recounted the real facts. How Kyle had willfully cheated on and abandoned me after I'd been upfront about my infertility from the start. how he'd grown abusive and mocked my condition, violating the prenuptial agreement we'd signed about dealing with this issue together through IVF or other treatments. Mr. Walker is an adulterer and a liar who has caused severe emotional trauma to my client, Jessica stated, her voice like steel. We will be seeking full entitlement of assets as well as spousal support on Miss Archer's behalf. She has more than upheld her end of their marital contract. I could feel Kyle's hateful glare burning a hole in the side of my head, but I didn't dare look his way. I was too busy fighting back a triumphant smirk. This was merely the opening salvo. By the time these proceedings were over, Kyle would be left with nothing but the clothes on his back. Every last penny, property, and asset would be striped from him in recompense for his cruelty. And even that wouldn't be enough for me. The legal realm was just the start. I would make it my life's mission to utterly decimate Kyle's existence down to the bone. He thought he'd been humiliated at Amy's wedding? He hadn't seen anything yet. As the judge droned on, laying out the schedule for evidence presentation and witness testimony, I allowed myself a sidelong glance at my soon-to-be ex-husband. Our eyes met, and I made sure he could see the cold, brutal determination in my gaze, a silent promise of the suffering to come. Kyle's sneer faltered for just a moment before he looked away. Good. He was finally starting to understand that he'd awoken a vengeful beast that would never rest until he paid the ultimate price. And I always collected what was owed to me. The rhythmic tapping of my manicured nails against the sleek desktop provided a steady metronome as I pored over the documents laid out before me. Financial records, property deeds, business prospectus files, I had dug up every last scrap of Kyle's personal and professional life like a bloodhound. My eyes narrowed as I studied the latest incriminating paper trail. So this was how Kyle had been funding his tawdry little affair with that perky blonde Jade, siphoning money from his sham of a business into an offshore account, thinking he could hide his indiscretions from me. Fool. There wasn't a single underhanded deal or shady transaction that could escape my scrutiny. Not when I had the most powerful tools in my arsenal, an encyclopedic knowledge of real estate loopholes, and my unshakable thirst for vengeance. The divorce proceedings had been a mere opening salvo. Kyle had been so smug, so sure he could bully and manipulate his way into keeping the bulk of our assets like he had in his previous marriage. But I'd beaten him at his own game, stripping away everything he tried to protect until he was left with next to nothing. Yet that still wasn't enough for me, not by a long shot. No, I needed to ghost Earth on his entire miserable existence, destroy every last thread of his finances, his reputation, his future prospects, until he was left as a sniveling, impoverished husk. Only then would I finally be able to breathe freely again. A sudden knock at the door broke my concentration. Come in, come in. I called out crisply. Jessica strode into the room, her sharp gaze scanning the paper trail laid out before me. Working late again, I see, she remarked with a hint of admiration. You really are relentless when you set your mind to something, Vivian. You know me, I replied with a thin smile. I never leave a job half-finished. Well, your dedication is certainly paying off. Jessica set a glossy folder on the desk between us. I have the latest updates on our extracurricular activities regarding Mr. Walker. I snatched up the folder eagerly, flipping it open to examine the contents. A feral grin slowly spread across my face as I took in the damning evidence. Phone records, financial statements, photos. All the proof I needed to bring the next phase of my revenge scheme crashing down on Kyle's head. This is perfect, I purred, looking up at Jessica with undisguised glee. He'll never see this coming. I must admit, I had my doubts when you first proposed this undertaking, Jessica said carefully. It's not exactly something they cover in law school ethics courses. But you're a professional who understands that ethical rules are more like guidelines, I countered with a wink, especially when the ends justify the means. Jessica's cool demeanor cracked slightly as she let out a low chuckle. Well, when you put it that way, let's just say I've enjoyed being on the winning team for once. Don't worry. You'll be compensated handsomely for all your efforts, I assured her, already turning my mind to the delicious ways I could dismantle Kyle's world using this new intel. Thanks to you, that bastard is going to wish he'd never been born by the time I'm through with him. I have no doubt, Jessica murmured, almost sounding impressed against her will. She drew her blazer a little tighter. Well then, I'll leave you to it. Just let me know if there's anything else I can do to assist in your endeavors. I was already only half listening, my laser focus burning through the documents before me as I began formulating my intricate new game plan. Kyle thought he could slither away from our marriage and build a new life on top of the ashes like some soulless phoenix. He was about to learn just how foolish that assumption was. I would make certain he had no life to go back to at all. Not when I was through burying every last remnant of his very existence. Let the real games begin. The harsh buzzing of the intercom dragged me from my slumber. Bleary-eyed, I fumbled for the phone. Yes? What is it? I mumbled. Miss Archer, there's someone here claiming to be your husband? The confused voice of the doorman crackled through the line. He's demanding to be let up, but I know you have that restraining order in place. I was abruptly wide awake, icy tendrils of dread lancing through me. Sure enough, I could make out the muffled shouting of an all-too-familiar voice echoing up from the lobby. Don't let him anywhere near this building, I ordered, my tone brooking no argument as I slipped from bed and began hastily dressing. I'm calling the police right now. Yes, ma'am. Alerting security as well. I could still hear Kyle's drunken bellowing faintly through the line as I jammed my feet into a pair of shoes. That reckless idiot, did he really think he could just violate the protection order without consequences? Then again, he'd never been one to think things through. His arrogance and temper were about to be his undoing once again. I threw on a coat over my pajamas and stormed out into the hallway, stabbing at the elevator call button with far more force than necessary. The doors opened with an obedient ding, but I barely registered them as I continued mashing the button furiously. Stupid, worthless piece of... Whoa! Hey! A startled voice made me spin around. A young man in a bathrobe stood there gaping at me, his eyes wide. Just a neighbor, clearly bemused by my behavior. You need to take it easy there, ma'am, he said carefully, as if talking someone down from a ledge. It's just an elevator, yeah. No need to bash the thing up. I opened my mouth to issue a blistering retort, but the words died in my throat as a sudden crash echoed from the stairwell down the hall, following by the unmistakable sounds of shouting and a scuffle. Get off me! You rent-a-cop morons! That psycho bitch is my wife. My heart plummeted into my stomach as I recognized Kyle's voice. He was here, in the building. Somehow he'd slipped past the security downstairs. The stairwell door burst open, and Kyle came tumbling through, grappling with two large guards in ill-fitting uniforms. A lamp went crashing to the floor in the melee, and the neighbor let out a strangled yelp as he flattened himself against the wall. You! Kyle's bloodshot eyes landed on me with feral hatred as the guards struggled to subdue his flailing limbs. You did this to me, you miserable Barren hag! You took everything from me! Shards of glass crunched underfoot as he broke free for just a moment, lunging at me with outstretched hands as if to wring my neck. The guards recovered quickly, seizing him by the shoulders and slamming him face first into the wall with sickening force. Get him out of here, I said quietly, adrenaline thrumming through me as I watched Kyle's pathetic form slump to the floor. And make sure he gets booked this time. The wail of approaching sirens echoed up from the street below, announcing the cavalry's arrival. I lifted my chin, refusing to let that sniveling worm see me flinch or show any weakness whatsoever. This was just another hiccup in my long-game agenda, a minor inconvenience that would barely dent the surface of the torment I had in store for Kyle, one that would never, ever stop until he was utterly erased from existence. As the police stormed in to subdue and haul away my raving soon-to-be ex-husband, I turned and headed back towards my apartment, chin held high. Kyle could scream and rage all he wanted. It only made my ultimate victory all the sweeter. The neighbor was still frozen against the wall, staring at me with a mixture of horror and awe. I offered him a thin smile as I passed. You may want to get those locks changed, dear, I said lightly. This building clearly has a bit of a pest problem. I sipped my mimosa leisurely, basking in the warm California sun filtering through the patio doors. Laughter and cheerful chatter drifted over from where my husband Nathan played an energetic game of tag with our rambunctious 5-year-old son in the backyard. Mommy, Mommy, did you see me run from Daddy? the little whirlwind came barreling over, his cheeks flushed with exertion and delight. "I saw, baby," I chuckled, ruffling his tousled brown hair. "You're getting so fast." "Not fast enough to outrun me forever." Nathan joined us with a roguish grin, scooping up our giggling son and pelting him with raspberries against his neck. I watched the tender scene with a sense of contentment settling over me like a warm blanket. To think, just a few years ago I had been trapped in a bitter, loveless marriage headed for an inevitable explosion. If someone had told me back then that this kind of happiness and peace was in my future, I would have laughed in their face. Yet, here I was, the proud mother of the child I'd longed for, sharing my life with a caring partner who adored me. All because I'd had the strength to walk away from the toxic situation with my previous husband and take my future into my own hands. Nathan set our son down, allowing him to scamper off towards the swing set before settling onto the patio lounge beside me. He draped an arm around my shoulders, pressing a kiss to my temple. "You look so beautiful sitting here like the queen you are," he murmured in that deep timbre that still made my heart flutter after all this time. I leaned into his embrace with a contented sigh. "I'm just relieved we were able to have this," I said honestly. "For so long, I thought motherhood was an impossible dream." "Well, you never gave up on that dream despite everything," Nathan said fondly. "That's one of the things I admire most about you, Viv. Your perseverance in the face of adversity is downright awe-inspiring." A wry smile tugged at my lips as I thought about just how strong I'd had to be to overcome the adversity of my failed first marriage, to dismantle my ex's entire existence through sheer grit and determination, ensuring he was left with a ruined husk of a life as penance. Of course, Nathan knew none of those unsavory details. I'd been careful to keep that dark period tightly under wraps, not wanting its poison to seep into my fresh start. As far as he and the rest of the world were concerned, I was simply a successful career woman who had prioritized her goals for many years before allowing love into her life again. They didn't need to know the brutal lengths I'd gone to in order to enact my ultimate revenge. How I'd systematically stripped my ex of his finances, his business, his reputation, until he was left homeless on the streets, a broken, destitute shell of a man. A harsh punishment, to be sure, but a fitting one after the way he'd betrayed and tormented me over my infertility. "You know, I actually ran into Kyle the other day," Nathan suddenly spoke up, jarring me from my thoughts. "Well, I should say he ran into me while panhandling on the street." My blood froze in my veins at the mention of that name, the one remnant of my dark past that I could never fully escape, no matter how much I tried to bury it. "He's really in a bad way these days," Nathan went on, oblivious to my discomfort, raving about some grand injustice being done to him, how his life was stolen away by a vindictive woman. I kept my expression carefully neutral, even as my heart thudded against my ribcage. So my masterful machinations had reduced Kyle to a delusional, rambling beggar spouting conspiracies to anyone who would listen. Fitting, in a tragically poetic way. Nathan shook his head sadly. "I almost felt sorry for the guy, to be honest. Until he got aggressive and started shouting threats, that is. Had to call the cops to get him to move along." "I see," I said tightly, grateful when our son came bounding over to recapture Nathan's attention. I took a long pull from my mimosa, willing my body to release its tension. The truth was, I didn't feel even an ounce of pity for the broken man Kyle had become. He was simply reaping what he'd sown through his vile actions all those years ago. A waking nightmare of his own making that he was doomed to endure, alone and forgotten by the world. Perhaps someday I would be able to purge him from my thoughts completely and bask in this new life I'd built without any lingering shadows. But until then, I would wear the scars of my trials like badges of honor, reminders of my strength. After all, I was the one who had risen from the ashes to become unstoppable, and I would never let anyone make me a victim again.